And we are with Tucker Drake from the Atheist in the Trailer Park podcast. Tucker, I have a few questions for you. Were you ever religious? And if you were, how did you come to your non-belief?
I was raised Lutheran, and I ultimately lost my faith in church.
That's an interesting place to lose it. Did you look behind the pew? Because sometimes, those pews are really hard, and sometimes stuff falls out of the pockets for the pastors to pick up later,
No, actually, I was sitting in the back, and we had cushions on our pews. So,
oh, lucky you.
No, I was. I was like 16, 17, somewhere around there, maybe 18, and I was having doubts, and they happened to be reading that particular week from the Sermon on the Mount.
No,
and they read from the section where, God condemns, or, Jesus condemns divorce. Well, my parents had divorced some years back, and it was really for the best. And my girlfriend at the time, her parents were going through a divorce, and her father was abusive, both physically and emotionally. And, I knew that there was literally no way that anybody could reason with him to convince him that, well, he's being a jerk and that he needs to stop. So when I heard, Jesus condemned divorce, I was like, well, that just doesn't make any sense, because there's no logical way you can convince me that my parents would be better off still being married, or my girlfriend's parents would be better off being married, because I know what they're like. I know their act, I know a lot of the details involved, and anybody who says that is crazy. And I also realized, well, our church doesn't have a problem with divorce. And if, it's Jesus who's condemning divorce, not one of the disciples or somebody who came after him condemning divorce, and we agree with it, we agree with the idea of divorce, then obviously we don't put a whole lot of stock in what Jesus actually said, assuming he actually said any of that. And then the next verse they read was also from the Sermon on the Mount, and that was where Jesus says, I say to you that any man who looks at a woman with lust has committed adultery. I'm like, but that's how we're wired up. If we weren't wired up like that, the species would have trouble reproducing. Anybody who doesn't accept that and understand that doesn't understand humanity. How can an all-powerful being not understand, the biological drives which are built into us to propagate the species?
Yeah, we would definitely not even be here. We would have gone extinct by now. Kind of like the pandas are kind of going. They're like on the endangered list right now, because they look at the other panda and goes, "Yeah, I don't want any of that. I think I'll just go over here and eat some bamboo."
Right, and actually, their diet is part of the problem, because they prefer bamboo, but they're not really adapted to eat it, so they have to eat way more food than they would if they ate, meat or any other kinds of plants out there, because the particular bamboo they prefer is very low in nutrition.
Well, that explains so much.
And the other thing that I found out that was just stunning is that nobody knew pandas existed until the 1920s.
Yeah, you don't see those in the Bible, do you?
No.
What's always very funny is sometimes you see those pictures of the animals going to Noah's Ark, and they show two male lions going in side by side, and I'm like, yeah, good luck getting those two male lions to reproduce there, buddy.
Right. And I don't know if lions would be considered kosher or not, because it's not really 2 by 2. It's, if they're clean animals, there's 7 pairs, and if they're unclean, it's just 1 pair.
Yeah. The Bible is very contradictory in that part, where it says in one part it says 2 by 2, and then it said 7 by something or whatever. That it was completely nonsense. We actually talked about that on my secondary podcast, The Atheist, the Bible, No Wardrobe, a while back. And we basically debunked the whole Noah story with just one word: feces.
Yeah. Yeah. Have you seen the video that they have? Somebody posted it on YouTube of, it's supposedly how the sanitation system worked on Noah's Ark, according to Ken Ham.
I've seen Ken Ham's. I saw a video of how Ken Ham thinks it was done, like some kind of rotating stock thing, elevator or whatever inside the building, which was supposed to lift him up and shoot it out somewhere.
Yeah. I've shown that to engineers. They all broke down in hysterics because apparently not only is that really convoluted for what it's trying to do, it actually would have caused the Ark to sink quite easily. It's one of those things. I mean, I'm looking at it and I'm not a trained engineer and I'm going, this doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense. And and then I showed the link, the video to some engineers, and they were like, oh no, this will not work at all. You've got this giant cavity in the middle of the ship where water is, because that's how it works. And they're going, this will cause this instability problem. If you get a big enough wave, it'll overflow. And why would you have it go this way when you could do it this other way? And it would be vastly simpler and easier.
Yeah, he's just making stuff up at that point, because it does not say, we've read that, and it does not say anything about that. So everything past that point, it's just all out of his imagination past that point.
Yeah. And I know there was I think the proper term is a marine architect. That's the guy that designed ships, who he did an article for somebody and just ripped the design, the exterior design of the Ark to shreds. He says, because the one thing that I remember is that the prow on the Ark, on Ken Ham's version of the Ark, is utterly unnecessary because it's not a powered vessel.
Exactly. What are they going to do? Get people out and pushing with their feet, or get a couple penguins out there and pushing them?
Right. And I can remember when I was a kid seeing one of those, Noah's Ark things, because they thought it was up on Mount Ararat in Turkey. And they did a water tank test with a rectangular design. And they shook the tank so that it to simulate rough waters, and wow, it did fantastic as far as staying upright and afloat. Whereas when they had something that was sort of like Ham's design, and that it had a prow on it and stuff like that, it promptly sank and went to the bottom of the tank.
And the thing is, I've seen a video where they showed the back of the building. It's actually a building. There's actually a building part on there. If you see pictures of the Ken Ham's boat or whatever online or whatever, they just show the front because it's like, oh yeah, here's the Ark. But if you go around to the back side, there's literally a building attached to it. Let's just say that there was a major flood in that area. The building would sink, or I guess, or get washed away.
That's what I always bring up when it comes to the Noah's Ark thing, is that because I've talked to engineers too, and some of the engineers that I've spoken to said that Ken Ham's version, like the boat's so big that it's no way it's possibly seaworthy, even by today's standards.
Yeah. Oh yeah. There was no way. I mean, he had to have metal attachments and whatnot put in there just to keep it safe, so people could actually just walk through it. And they didn't have that technology back then.
Yeah. And I'm sure you saw all the photos of the cranes and everything else hoisting stuff. Have you read, the book is called The Ark Before Noah by Irving Finkel?
No, I've never even heard of that book.
Oh, wow. You will definitely want to check it out. Irving Finkel he works for the British Museum in London, and he's an expert on Babylon.
Okay.
And some guy showed up one day in like the late 80s, early 90s, because they have a day where bring your historical stuff to us and we'll tell you what it is. And this guy showed up and he's like, I got this little clay tablet. I don't know what it is. Finkel looked at it and said, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And he tried to get the guy to let him borrow it, and the guy wouldn't let him do it. And it is the oldest known version of a flood myth. And it predates, it predates it predates even the Epic of Gilgamesh. That's how far back it goes.
Wow.
Yeah. And so he eventually managed to he kept after this guy for like decades, and he managed to finally get the guy to loan him the thing long enough so that they could do, they could scan it, preserve it, and he could do a good translation of it. And it's the earliest account of a flood myth. And the unique thing about it is that instead of the ark, instead of being a, like a barge style or Ken Ham's boat style, it is what's known as a coracle, which is a round boat, which are, they're made out of rope, and they're a traditional boat in that part of Iraq where Babylon used to be. Gosh, I think it's like 7,000 years old, the tablet or something like that. It's insanely old. And the book he wrote about, getting the tablet, translating it, and all the history associated with it is fascinating. And it also has the complete text of that tablet in it. But it is really, it's like taking a college course. It is really intense.
I just want to mention, I have seen the boat that you're talking about, because it's the round boat that
right.
It kind of looks like a sombrero.
Yeah.
But I've seen that where there's a video that was on that. Anyway, I do have some other questions for you.
Okay.
You're doing a lot of different stuff on your podcast. You do a news episode, and then you do you've been reading books. You read one a while back that talked about how they explained like where we get the number 7 from, like the planets and whatnot. And now you're reading the Apocrypha. How far along are you in that book anyway? What made you decide to read the Apocrypha, by the way?
What made me decide to read the Apocrypha was I finished up T.W. Doan's Bible Myths and Their Parallels in Other Religions, and I was like,
that's the one.
Yeah, I'm like, I got to have something else to read. What am I going to pick? And I was kind of, sticking around thinking about different things. And everybody's done the Book of Mormon. There's plenty of people doing the Quran. So I was like, I need something to get people who, to listen to me rather than listen to the other guys, because I'm nowhere near as funny as, Noah and Heath and all those at Scathing Atheist or whatever.
Yeah.
I
always say, when people say you're funny, I say, well, looks aren't everything. I'm just saying.
I always say any humor on the podcast is completely unintentional. So I was like, well, nobody I know of has done the Apocrypha. And, Catholics follow some of the books of the Apocrypha. Greek Orthodox follow other books. The Ethiopian Christians follow, follow all the apocryphal books, and the Russian Orthodox follow a subset of the apocryphal books. So I was like, that kind of covers a lot of the major non-Protestant religions.
Right. You said in one of your shows that you had actually found out that referencing some of your other materials, like, wow, there's this other book they didn't even mention, and it's part of it that you're going to have to be reading into it. Have you gotten into that part? And I'm just kind of curious, how far in advance have you been reading your books? I mean,
I go into them cold.
Okay. So you just read them when you get a chance to read them then, basically.
Yeah. And the one I was talking about that I didn't know existed, I just wrapped that up. It was actually fairly short, so I managed to bang it out in a single episode which was the one that went up last Sunday.
Yeah. All right. Then that's one I heard just recently then. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was just wrapped up in that one then. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I have a couple other questions here. What made you decide to go into podcasting?
Well,
glamour.
I'll be honest. At the time, I had a really crappy job. What I say that, and then of course it kind of, in some ways, it beats my current job. But I could listen to anything I wanted to because I could wear headphones, and so because I worked with a lot of Bubba types.
Yeah, I know the people.
I had started downloading, all these atheist podcasts, and I was listening to this one podcast, and the other thing is, at the time, I didn't have a car, so I was having to take the bus to and from work, which was a 2-hour trip one way.
Wow.
Right. So I'm on my phone because the bus has free Wi-Fi. I'm on my phone reading news articles and all these other things. And I was listening to this one podcast that was atheist related, and they were talking about an article, and I had actually read that article, so I was familiar with it. And they were asking all these questions about things, and I'm like, you guys could not have read past the first 2 paragraphs in that article, or you wouldn't be asking these questions. They weren't like rhetorical type questions. They were questions that, you wouldn't ask if you were familiar with the topic at all, because the information in the article basically would blow those ideas out of the water easily. And on that same episode, they had an email from somebody where the person wrote in and says, you guys, you make mistakes, and, you don't really correct them. And they're like, well, hey, we're just basically, we're just here to talk, and you guys get to listen in, and we don't really care if we make a mistake. Not, wow. Hey, we're doing this, and, we know it's wrong, but we can get a really good joke out of it, or something like that. It was just, we just don't care. And then they complained. They said, we got to get $400 an episode out of this, or we're not going to be able to keep doing the podcast. And I'm like, okay, I know what these guys make because they've talked about their day jobs, right? And they're all in industries where they make close to 6-figure incomes.
Jeez.
Right. And I know what doing a podcast costs. If you depending on how you set the thing up, it can either cost you nothing or next to nothing to do it. And I'm like, if I could make $400 a month, forget about $400 a week doing a podcast, I could be out of this fucking beer can.
Yeah.
So I was like, and I, and I was pretty mad because, hey, if we're going to claim we're better than the religious types, then when we find out we're wrong, we got to admit it.
No, you're absolutely correct. If we make a mistake on the show, we try to correct it. I mean, recently we had a show where we talked about the Scolari guy, whatever his name was. He was the one that went to jail because he did some insider trading and whatnot. And we did make a correction on the following show because we thought he was involved with the EpiPen scandal where they jumped up the prices. It turns out he was just saying, yeah, they should have a right to jump up their prices for no reason whatsoever.
Oh, yeah. Not Scolari. I know who you're talking about. Scarelli, that's his name.
Scarelli, that's it. Yeah. We did correct it later on. It just that someone got their panties in a bunch because we got a piece of information wrong, and we thought we had their information right. We strive to try to be correct on the show as much as we possibly can, and if we make a mistake, we own up to it later on. We try to, at least we try to, but I mean. Yeah. We can't catch everything, unfortunately. So
yeah. Speaking of Scarelli, have you read the transcripts of them trying to seat a jury in his trial?
No, I have not.
Oh, I will drop a link to that story because they are some of the funniest things you have ever read in your life.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, because like one of the things is somebody like one of the jurors, the reason, or potential jurors, the reason he gave for not being able to serve on the jury was they were mad at Scarelli for disrespecting the Wu-Tang Clan.
I'll have to remember that one next time I get called for jury duty. Did he disrespect the Wu-Tang Clan? Well, I'm out then. I can't do this.
Oh, dare you.
Yeah, no. I mean, it's just hysterical about all the stuff that, you know, somebody like walks into the thing. They had no idea who he was, but they looked at his face and they said, he just looks guilty.
I've actually heard that. I was involved in a court case a number of years back, and the judge was going through things like that and asking what they thought, whatever. And one of them says, well, the reason why he's on trial is because he's automatically guilty. Is like the judge's like, no, he's not guilty just because he's on trial. That's the whole reason. So they dismissed him. And I was like, oh man, I wish I had thought of saying something like that. I would have been able to get out of jury duty. I've been called for jury duty like 4 times, and I've only had to serve once. And I've been able to get out of it other times for other reasons.
Yeah, no. I mean, like one of the things is, like, you know, somebody says, I think he's a greedy little man.
Nice. I have some other questions here. How do you go about producing your podcast? How do you edit and get them posted? I know you're using like Libsyn, but I mean, what do you use to edit your software? And do you just record just audio? I mean, you do like over Skype or you use another chat program to talk with your guests?
When I have a guest on, I use Skype and a program called MP3 Skype Recorder, which is a free program because I can't afford to pay for anything. That it automatically, the great thing about it is like when you do a Skype call, it automatically fires up, starts recording the call.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. And you can set it up so that you can, you know, it'll record your guest in one channel and you in the other channel, or it can just, you know, do a mono track where you're both, you know, in the same channel. And then I edit everything in Audacity, which is another free program.
Oh, I'm familiar with Audacity. Your shows are about an hour long. How long do you actually record for? Because I notice a lot of times when you're talking about, it's like, all right, off to the Googles, and then you're like back immediately. How long is the longest time you've had between, okay, we got to check Google or something, and then you came back and said, okay, I have like about an hour's worth of recording here that it's just dead air or me mumbling to myself?
Well, when I go to the Googles, I put Audacity on pause.
Okay. You do it the easy way.
Yeah. No. Although I have had situations where, you know, I'll have a guest on and we just get to gabbing, and I'll end up with 6 hours of audio I have to edit down, which is not a lot of fun, but, you know, it is what it is.
We recently did a crossover show with the Brainstorm podcast, and we had some kind of weird technical difficulty because Google Hangouts, and we recorded for 3 hours, and I spent like 2 hours just clearing out space on my hard drives just so I could edit the video, and it was just 3 hours. So I know that takes a lot of time, and it took me almost a full extra day. So if, let's say you recorded for 6 hours, how long would that take you to edit that?
It would probably take me about 6 hours, because when I do my editing, Audacity has this neat little feature that allows you to speed up the recording, and at 1.5 times normal speed, you get chipmunking of the voices, but it's not so bad that you can't figure things out. So that's how I do the editing. Plus, it also disguises the sound of my voice, since I can't stand the sound of my own voice. So
I totally get that. Most people generally don't like the sound of their own voices. What is one of the more interesting podcast shows you listen to? I mean, besides, you know, this show, Packard Pokes That.
Well, one of my favorite podcasts, it's not atheist related, but the guy who does the podcast certainly has the, you know, the skeptical mindset in mind when he does the show. Is called My History Can Beat Up Your Politics.
I've heard of that show. I've heard you mention it a few times.
Yeah, no, the guy who does it is his name is Bruce Carlson, and he takes a fairly unbiased look at modern events and in American politics. He doesn't do international because that'd just be way too complicated. But he takes, he takes a current event and then he finds something from American history that kind of matches up with it, and then he does a comparison and contrast with what happened then as to what's happening now or what could happen now. And it's really fascinating because there have been episodes where I've been listening to it and it's like, oh, well, he's going to be talking about this one thing, and it goes along and it's like, wait, no, he's going in a direction I couldn't have possibly imagined. He would have found something from our history that matched up with this.
Interesting. So he's seen spider webs of history pieces that most people probably were not even aware of, basically.
Right. I mean, sometimes he'll pull out a, just this insanely obscure event, even stuff that happened from recent history. I mean, like there was an episode he did on Ed Muskie in the 70s. Who he was, I don't remember if he was a Democratic presidential or vice presidential candidate, but there was questions about his mental capacity and things like that. And he did this right at the time when there were issues with Hillary. And it was amazing the kinds of parallels he found. And it was, he doesn't stretch things well, so that this is sort of like whatever is happening now. I mean, they are really, really close, eerily close almost. And he did a podcast not too long ago on the emoluments clause in the Constitution. And it was like, wait, he pulled this weird event that was from, shortly before or shortly after the country was founded. And it's like, wow, I had never even heard of anything like this. And it was really fascinating because of how, detailed he got into it and how important this event, which wouldn't even qualify as a footnote, actually was in how the Constitution was drafted and interpreted.
Interesting. That's interesting. I will have to check out that show. I have one last question here, and then I'm going to turn over the questions over to my co-host. And by the way, thank you, Matt, for joining us. That's one of my other co-hosts. He just joined us now. My last question here is, what do you do outside your podcasting persona? Like, what do you do in real life? I mean, I know, but my podcast listeners might not know.
Well, currently I work for a company that we make medical supplies. Bandages, eye shields for surgeons. So, when they're cutting into somebody and the blood sprays, it doesn't get in their eye. Things like that, which it's job security, but it's not really all that interesting.
Yeah, no, I understand that. I remember you were talking about on one of your previous jobs where you were stamping out these metal pieces and they were being sold or improperly made because they were working with the federal government, as I recall. And you talked to somebody in the federal government about how shoddy their work was, and it somehow got back to them and you ended up getting let go. That's part of your public record, so I'm not like exposing anything you haven't already talked about.
No, I was working for a foundry, and that wasn't why I got let go, but it was not too long after I turned them in to the feds that I happened to get let go. But yeah, and that was a bit of a nightmare because I discovered that you can't just call the feds up and say, hey, I know these guys are doing wrong. You have to have an insane amount of level of documentation to give to the feds. Mind you, the feds did show up and investigate, but there was no hope of prosecution without me giving them this massive amount of documentation, which I couldn't have had access to because it didn't exist. Because that was one of the things that the issues I had was with that particular employer was that there were all kinds of things we did. There was no documentation, and there was supposed to be a paper trail for this stuff, and there wasn't.
Oh, really?
Yeah, yeah. And even if there, if there was, it was nothing I saw, but I should have seen. I mean, in the years since, I worked for a company that made parts for Boeing. Mm-hmm. And if you make parts for Boeing, the documentation is voluminous. They have, they ship you the material you use. They have specific tags on all that material. They ship you the tooling you're supposed to use to machine that material. You have, you're supposed to run, say, they give you a shipment, you're going to generate 10,000 parts. The tooling is designed for 1,000 parts. And that's when you're supposed to change it out. Doesn't matter if the tooling is still good. When it hits the 1,000 part mark, you have to change that tooling out. You have to keep the old tooling. You have to keep all the scrap material. Boeing has their own inspectors who come into the facility to check the parts that you're running. They weigh all the scrap. They inspect all the discarded tooling. And, so there's huge amounts of documentation. The place I was working at that I reported to the feds, you'd get a pan of parts and they'd say, yeah, machine these or do this or that with them. And there was no paperwork with it.
Wow, that's incredibly slimy.
Yeah, no. So I didn't, they're still in business, but because the fact that the feds showed up there and other places, they've had to change their business practices, and they've lost a number of customers because of me. So,
oh, well, that's not on you. That's on them. I just want to say.
Yeah, no, I mean, I have friends who were, at the time I had friends who were in the military and who were in places in Iraq. And I was like, one of my friends who I grew up with could be killed because we shipped somebody a shoddy part. I can't sit idly by. And my family history is such that one of my ancestors was best friends with Thomas Jefferson, and Jefferson made him an ambassador to France. So I can't exactly, say whatever. I sort of have to speak up in such a situation.
No, I think you did the right thing personally. All right, I am going to turn my questions over to my co-host, Atheist Ranger. You had a question, you said.
I have two, actually. And
okay.
These questions are mostly based on kind of an annoyance. My first question is, when it comes to religion, what is your number one pet peeve and why?
Actually, my number one pet peeve with religion is not so much with the religious, it's with the atheist community. And it has to do with the idea that one religion is worse than another. Because if you understand the history of religion and human psychology, you realize that, because everybody likes to say, well, Islam is the worst religion. They're killing all these people. They're doing all these things. Well, Christianity did that a long time ago. They like to do it. But if you really look at things objectively, they're still doing it today because, you have Christians who refuse to seek medical treatment and would rather rely on prayer to treat disease. Well, if you die because your parents or you decided to pray away, your cancer, you're just as dead as if some Islamic nut job shot your ass. And if, so the difference between the two is that, one makes the national news and the other doesn't.
Yeah, I actually agree with that. I've gotten into arguments actually with other atheists because they didn't like the fact that like my channel, for example, mostly focuses on, just attacking idiot Christians. And I've actually gotten responses from other atheists because I don't attack Islam enough to their liking.
Yeah. And I mean, look at all the medical research that's being blocked because it offends people. You know, oh, well, we can't do stem cell research because you use aborted fetus tissue. Well,
Exactly.
you know, people are dying because of that. And nobody objects to the fact that the eggs that are the fertilized embryos that are unwanted from IVF procedures, those are burned. Nobody objects to that crap, but they object to using fetal tissue from abortions, and you can't use fetal tissue or frozen embryos from IVF treatments that the people who had the procedure don't need anymore for stem cell research.
Speaking of stem cell research, real quick here, I don't know if I heard it on your show because you're reading a news article, or maybe I heard it somewhere else, but they found a way recently they can actually use stem cells from adults now instead of having to go to children. So they can take it right from the person who's donating the stem cells.
If my understanding of it is correct, they have some ability to use them. It's not total. So like they can get the stem cells from your teeth and use those to regrow teeth, but they couldn't use those stem cells in your teeth to, grow you a new kidney or whatever.
Okay. All right. I remember there was something about the stem cells that they're able to do, but I just couldn't remember what it was. Ranger, I'm sorry. Did you have some other questions?
Yeah, just one more. Out of all of the apologists, no matter what the religion, out of all the apologists that are here on YouTube, which one annoys you the most?
Well, actually, I don't pay any attention to any of them. I'm terrible in that instance. It's like the whole, there's this huge Mythicon or Mythos, whatever, that Milwaukee convention.
Yeah, I got you.
I have no idea who any of those people are. I generally don't know who any of the the Christian apologists are. Just it doesn't float in my circle. So I mean, I've seen some various apologetics. I'm familiar with the concept. Still don't understand why you would call it apologetics. That just seems well, we're sorry.
That's when I heard that first time I heard apologetics, I was like, why are you apologizing? Oh, that's not what it means. Well, that's exactly what it sounds like.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, I have to tell you this lie.
Yeah, so I don't pay any attention to that. I know there's all kinds of scandals and things in various groups, communities. Unless I'm somehow directly involved, I don't pay any attention to them because there's just too much other stuff to worry about.
Yeah, I totally get that. Matt, did you have some questions for our guest?
I just had one. When did you become an atheist?
I didn't really start calling myself as an atheist until I was in my early 30s. And I'm not entirely sure what made me do it. I mean, it was after 9/11, and I mean, I still wasn't in tune with like Dawkins and them saying, it doesn't matter what your religion is, it's bad, it should be done away with. But just at some point after that, I realized I got to speak up. I got to call myself an atheist. I mean, I was more than willing to admit to myself I didn't believe that there was a God, but I wasn't willing to use that term.
Since we have no other questions, Tucker, where can they find your show and other places they can contact you at?
Well, it's on iTunes, Stitcher, all the usual podcast places. There's the Facebook page, The Atheist in the Trailer Park. If you Google that, I'm pretty much the only thing, or I'll be the first hit that comes up. The site for the show is tparkatheist.blogspot.com. I've got an actual URL that redirects to it, but I can never remember it. So
I know the feeling. I did have a question. Do you have a Twitter account or anything like that? Or
yep. That's linked to on the page.
Well, you might want to give it to us for our listeners here because they, a lot of people are.
It is tparkatheist on Twitter.
tparkatheist. All right, very good.